Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. I'm super pumped you're joining us today to have Dr. John Schneider. We're talking about his book on the Darwinian problem of evil and looking at animal suffering. So, John, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Well, I'm super pumped for this conversation. And in case you don't know who John is, he wrote a book on animal suffering and the Darwinian problem of evil. So, we're going to be talking about that book today and different theodicies to try to explain what's going on here with regards to the problem of evil and specifically animal suffering. But before we get into that, John, do you want to talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do?
Well, I've had kind of a long and varied career, mostly in academics. So I've spent the last, I spent about 40 years teaching theology, 5 years at Westmont College in California. Some of you will know about Westmont. And then I moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I taught at Calvin College, now Calvin University, for 27 years, 28 years, and decided to retire. I kind of retired into a fellowship position at Notre Dame at the Center for Philosophy of Religion there. And they funded me for a year to do research that eventually grew into this book that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
I recently moved from Michigan to Nebraska, so even as we talk, I'm sitting in a very small northeast Nebraska town called Wayne. And so it's a good thing you have remote technology, because it would be a little hard for us to get together, I think.
Yeah, I think it would be. Northwest Nebraska is a little ways out from where I'm in Southwest Virginia right now. So praise the Lord for that.
Yeah.
So we're gonna dive into this, John. So let's talk about like what is the Darwinian problem of evil and like why should we care about it?
Well, to put it really simply, if you think that species were created and designed by means of evolution, as a theory initiated by Darwin, and then has evolved over time. It looks like that's a method of creation or designing species, bringing about species, that while it's very successful, it's brought us about, according to the theory, it brought complex life about and all kinds of good things about. But along with it, one of the main byproducts of it has been a magnitude of suffering that is really kind of hard to imagine, especially if we think about it in terms of the deep time, planetary time, that geologists have revealed. Really, about the last 2.5 centuries, modern geologists, have made us aware that the Earth is vastly older than anyone imagined. But along with that discovery came a secondary discovery of life forms that had existed, entire species, really entire ecologies. Some have referred to them as worlds, entire worlds of plants and animals and biomes have come and gone, so that at the end, as we speak, biologists tell us that 99.9% of all species that ever existed are gone. And an awful lot of them without any trace of a genetic legacy. So you can't even argue that, say, the reason for their existence was to contribute to a progeny or to descendants. This looks to a lot of people, especially atheistic people, as so wasteful, inefficient, and if you think animals are capable of actual suffering in a moral way, cruel. And so it becomes very hard for some people to believe that an all-powerful and all-wise and morally perfect God would create nature this way and design the conditions of existence for animals in that fashion. And some people go further, and they'll see what we're talking about here, this Darwinian problem, the whole configuration of animal suffering that's been unveiled, as almost proof positive that there is no such God. So this is a problem of evil that impinges on the larger discussion about God and evil, and evidence for and against belief in theistic God, and in this case, I'm more concerned with a distinctly Christian God.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
That's just part of the problem, and when we could go on to talk about discoveries in modern biology involving the unveiling of an entire world of, I call them micro monsters, viruses, microbial diseases, various parasites, organisms whose at least most obvious role in nature is to inflict immense harm, disease, and death, intense suffering on innocent creatures. And so there's, at best on its surface or on its face, a real problem there in seeing it as plausible that the Christian God would have designed things that way. So obviously, if as a Christian you want to affirm Darwinian evolution, that God in fact did create that way, then it falls on you to give some kind of explanation as to how that's plausible, how those two things could be reconciled. The picture of God on the one hand, and then this configuration of animal suffering on the other. And that's apart from the human suffering that many of these things have caused since human beings arrived in the picture on the stage of time. And so those are two aspects of the problem. And in the book, I go into it even more deeply because one of my concerns in the book, one of my reasons for writing the book is I think some evolutionary creationists, as they often call themselves, that is, people who believe God created the world but did so by means of Darwinian evolution, are somewhat downplaying the complexity and seriousness of the problem, maybe treating it a little too casually as not that big a problem. And that is something I want to avoid. I want to stress that in the interest of honesty, integrity, credibility, that Christian thinkers should face this problem full on. And that includes an aesthetic aspect. As you looked at the book and you know that is a part of the problem, I call attention to something that's been ignored, really, or at least explicitly missing from the conversation, and that's the aspect of horror. Some of the things that we find in nature better fit philosophical descriptions of that genre than the merely tragic one or unpleasant one. And I give examples in the book of little creatures that do terrible, terrible things to animals. And those would make great horror films. In fact, a lot of the creatures that we've discovered resemble some of the creatures that we find in horror films. So it goes beyond just ordinary evil into something extraordinary. So once my view is that once one grasps the multi-layered nature of the problem and its atheistic force, that it's really very difficult to downplay it, and of course very, very difficult to explain all this very well. And my sense was that while people have made very heroic efforts to do so, in my judgment at least, none of the available explanations is good enough to really obviate the need for further searching for a better alternative if we can find one. And that was my goal in writing the book, is to find an approach to this that would improve the position of Christians in this conversation beyond what had already been achieved by people who've written on it.
That's super helpful. So thanks, John. I do want to emphasize this idea that it's very important for Christian to have some sort of account for explaining this phenomena. I remember being at a conference and this question was brought up, and it was a question of animal suffering over millions of years. And then the person talking kind of just pointed to a C.S. Lewis thing where it's You can't have evil without good, and you can't have good without God. And that was how you answered the problem of animal suffering. I remember listening to that, and I'm like, that seems lacking. Like, even if that's true, we still need to have some sort of account for why there is animal suffering. And it seems like to me, like, even if you're going to hold it like not necessarily like evolution, but even like progressive creation or intelligent design or something, you still have these millions of years of animal suffering that you have to deal with. The only people that may claim they can fully get off the hook is like a young Earth creationist, which may have their own problems that we'll talk about in a sec. So let's just dive into that, John, to start things off. So some people might point to like saying the fall, and the fall can fully explain animal suffering. So can you talk a little bit about that idea and how you critique it and why you think it ultimately falls short?
Well, it's of course an ancient explanation going back into earliest Christianity, at least some. And it's important to know not all Christians in the historic Christian tradition thought that the fall of Adam and Eve explained the origin of evil. Even theologians like Augustine, who believed there was a fall, also believed that it didn't really explain why there was so much evil and unpleasantness in nature. And so he developed a different theory about why that those kinds of so-called natural evils might exist, poisonous spiders, and he gives a whole list of things in nature that aren't very well explained by a human fall. And one of the problems that I underscore is well, there's a moral impropriety. If you really think about it, why would it makes some sense, at least, that God would punish or allow the consequences of human sin to fall upon human beings, so that you would have the propriety would be that a human being sins and human beings suffer. There are problems with that too, because a lot of people have suffered who didn't take part in that original sin. So that's a whole other topic. But that problem, that kind of idea or picture that God would punish descendants or something that ancestors did is really magnified by the notion that God punished, say, billions of animals throughout planetary time because of an act of disobedience that a human being did. So why in the world would God punish animals for something that humans did? That's one problem. There are other problems. Even if you believe in a fall, that there was an original pair, that's problematic too, as I'm sure you know, because in evolutionary theory, that's quite disputable. But church fathers like Irenaeus said, well, yeah, there was a fall, but it doesn't explain why there was a fall. And that's something I emphasize in the book, that, okay, so Adam and Eve did this horrible thing, so horrible that God found it fitting to bring ruin upon not just humanity, but the entire world of nature, animals, so on. World ruinous fall. But what conditions would have made that possible? The situation that God set up in the beginning had to be tremendously fragile. In other words, it had to be breakable in all those ways. And so that just drives the question more into a deeper layer, doesn't it? So maybe you say, well, the devil, Satan, broke in and caused all this and brought about all this ruin. But then you just push that question I raised back one more step. What accounts for the fragility such that God would allow a being not just to be free to obey or not, but to have that kind of explosive, ruinous potential in the event of disobedience. And then, of course, Irenaeus said that, and Origen and others, I'm talking about very ancient church fathers, who said that if God is omniscient, he surely knew in the beginning all of this was going to happen anyway. And so there are a lot of problems involved in trying to use the fall as not just as an account of beginnings, but as a theodicy, as an actual explanation a God justifying explanation for the evils that one was trying to explain.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's very vulnerable to criticism, and in my opinion, more than that, I think if you really analyze it in the way I do in the book, I think the appeal to the fall to explain animal suffering in nature is a pretty abject failure.
I really appreciate that, John. And I think it's helpful thinking about look at this dialect, like say that like someone's gonna say that like well the choice of Adam and Eve is the response of like all animal suffering. Well, you still have the question of like, well, God surely knew that like Adam and Eve are gonna fall.
Right.
And so you could say the similar thing if you attribute it to like maybe like demonic powers or things like that, which is why yeah, I
Right.
really appreciate that. And I think that's a
But
good
then God would
way of
have known
thinking.
these demonic beings were going to fall too. And then, I thought about this one night. I was reading C.S. Lewis, and some pretty important thinkers have wanted to blame Satan for the fall of nature. They're a little careful in the way they state that, but they entertain this possibility. But I think, isn't that a pretty monstrous thing to ascribe to God, that God would take this being, namely Satan, who makes Freddy Krueger, horror films almost look like an innocent by comparison. You're talking about some being, a superhuman being that wants to destroy, ruin the world in all the ways that we can look around and see that it's ruined. Evils of all kinds. It's at least difficult to imagine God putting a being like that in a position, um, where the fate of virtually everyone, human and non-human beings who would ever live, would be at the mercy of a decision such a monster would make. And again, like you suggest, I think God surely would have known, or at least foreseen or sensed that this could. And even if you want to say God didn't know it because you want to preserve the freedom of that creature that turns into such a monster, uh, you would have to be pretty brave to be risking the lives of so many creatures on a bet, a sort of gamble that, well, maybe this being would get it right. Maybe it's a 50-50 chance, but I don't think that works very well. It seems to me that the chances of free beings falling at some point are greater than that, probably close to certain. And that even if God didn't know in the strict sense uh, the future in some detail, that God would have been smart enough not to set things up in that way. So I guess so. What do I think? I think that there is some sense in which God knew the fall would happen, and that God planned um, on a history of redemption. Culminating in Christ, and then all the things that Christ has done in response to the fall. So, the technical word from my view is superlapsarianism. It's a big word, but it basically just means that God planned redemption in Christ before the fall. God wasn't surprised by the fall. The cross and the resurrection of Jesus is not plan B. That's something God came up with. Oh gosh, Adam and Eve have sinned now. I've got to do something different. My sense of it is, anyway, that God knew all along that these measures he would take in Christ, the incarnation, the atonement, the resurrection, all of it, were part of the plan from the beginning. Blessed is the Lamb who was slain from the beginning of the world. I take the verses like that pretty seriously. And there's a lot of precedent for my thinking there in the Christian tradition as well.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So thanks, John. So we explored this idea of like saying that the fall can account for an explanation of animal suffering. So now I'd love to talk about like the aesthetic theodicy. It's something you
Yeah.
interact with a lot. So it's this idea of like maybe there's some sort of like great beauty that comes from maybe like a process of like a lot of animal suffering. So can you talk about like what this is, and like can it answer the problem of animal suffering?
The well, to take a step back, one of the things that defenders of evolutionary creationism underline is that the suffering of animals if you look at it in a certain way, is not just bad, it's tragic. Tragedy, of course, has a long history in the discussion of aesthetics, going back to Aristotle, especially, who pointed out the value of tragedy. And that's manifested in tragic plays that were being written by the Greeks. And, there's a beauty in tragedy that Aristotle writes about and others have written about, and a nobility in it. A variety of good things come from tragedy, tragic goods. And so some writers have argued that the lives of animals, especially if we think of predation, where one animal takes the life of another in order to live, you can turn that around and say the other animal gives its life sacrificially to the other animal so that it might live. There's a kind of virtue in that, and a kind of beauty. Why do people drive hundreds of miles to witness an act of predation? A wolf chasing down. There is a terrible painfulness and badness about predation in some of those cases, anyway. Not all of them, I would say. Some are pretty much just horrible. Parasites and various other creatures that just tear into higher animals. But there are many examples of life and death in the animal world that most of us would agree are quite beautiful in their own way, in a tragic way, not in a cheerful way, but in a sublimely tragic way. And so if you think that's a good thing that goes together with the bad thing, then the question becomes, does it outweigh the bad? The death, the pain, the suffering that is involved in this beautiful thing. And I don't think it does, but I think it somewhat counteracts it. What we really need is a view. Well, let me say that tragic goods are among the goods that evolution creates or helps to create. So if we wonder why would God use evolution as a means of creating species, well, maybe one part of the answer is that God wanted a lot of tragic beauty. Now that I don't think you can rule that out right away, at least on Christian grounds, because look at how God chose to act in Christ. That is a truly tragic story, the passion of Jesus. And many people have written about it's a terrible, horrible story, but there's a beauty, dignity, a nobility, a greatness, an aesthetic greatness about that story. We see it in art, we see it in drama, we see it in literature. So it isn't really a stretch to think that the same God who acted in those ways with the sacrificial lamb known as Christ would do something comparable in nature. So, and I'm not the only writer who has compared the cross, the narrative of the cross, to the story of species. Some people have referred to the cruciform, the cross-like character of the story of life. So this is a way of looking at it, and some argue, John Hout, very important thinker in this regard, he seems to think that the beauty, that kind of beauty, does outweigh and justify God in creating by Darwinian means, despite the suffering. From the book, I agree with a lot of that. I think he's partly right, but I think it's really hard. I think it's really hard to argue in the end that this kind of tragic beauty and all the other goods that we can list that Darwinian evolution helps to create outweigh the magnitude of suffering that we're talking about. So I think we need a better way than that. It would be good anyway if we had a better way than that to think about God creating by Darwinian means.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks, Sean. And I think I really like your position on this, and I find a lot of sympathies where we can say like there is something to the idea that there is this like aesthetic beauty in a process of like the death and life of animals and things like
Right.
this, where there's something there, but it can't fully account. Like we need something further. And the something further you look at a little more in your book is the book of Job when thinking about the
That's
problem of
right.
animal suffering. So can you
Right.
talk a little bit about the book of Job and how it helps you think with the problem of animal suffering?
Well, one thing that is missing, or largely missing, in these highly philosophical and theological discussions of God and evil, including the evil of animal suffering in nature, is canonical biblical resources. Um, I think it's because people haven't really seen or understood the contributions that these sources could make to that discussion. Initially it would seem that these are purely religious sources. They're ancient. How could they really be strongly relevant to and helpful uh, to our attempts to resolve such complex questions? But I really got the idea of turning to biblical sources from a philosopher named Marilyn McCord Adams. And she wrote a book about what she called horrendous evils and human suffering. She didn't write about animal suffering. But one of her strong proposals was that biblical sources are not playing a big enough role in Christian discussions. It's kind of ironic because Christians, stand on canonical resources, but there seemed to be a sort of I wouldn't call it an attitude or dismissive or anything like that, but just a sense that the Bible, this ancient book, maybe doesn't have a whole lot to contribute to this extremely modern discussion. Modern
Mhm.
understood in Darwinian terms. What does Job know about Darwinian evils? This seems like a pretty big chasm to cross, right? But I in the book, I argue that Job is remarkably relevant to this problem. And in a lot of ways, probably one of the main ways is, and this is controversial, and it would be if you had experts on Job come in, they would argue about it and all that. But I mean, my main proposal is that what happened to Job in the book is that evils beset him. He was afflicted by evils that didn't conform to ordinary ethical or moral explanations. I mean, the reader is clued in right away that Job was righteous. He had done no wrong in the eyes of God. And so, in the theology that existed then, very strong, it's known as Deuteronomic theology. It's the ancient moral teaching of Israel prior to their exile in Babylon. They unquestioningly assume that if a person was righteous, really righteous in God's eyes, that person would not suffer moral disorder. The things that happened to Job were supposed to happen to wicked people. And to make a long story short, a lot of really righteous and innocent people suffered in the Babylonian exile. And the sad thing was that a lot of really not very righteous, even wicked, wealthy people got off the hook, bribed their way out of slavery and all the other sufferings that ordinary or poor people had to endure. So when Israel got back uh, into Palestine from years working as slaves in Babylon, they had this question: why do the righteous suffer? It seemed to falsify their entire moral picture of God, the world, and evils. And so Job is not just and this isn't just my opinion, an awful lot of scholars agree with this statement, that Job is not just an accidental literary character. He's an emblem. He represents a type of person who existed in Israel at that time, that post-exilic time, and had that question. And so Job suffers in a typological way, in a way that was typical of many, many, many Israelites. And they wondered, since they didn't deserve this, right? According to their own teachings, they didn't deserve any such thing. In fact, they deserved the opposite. What's going on? And of course, like any human being, they would wonder if their faith was in vain. What about this promise that God had made that he was building a messianic kingdom on earth, one in which peace, prosperity, justice would prevail everywhere for the righteous? This is the cause and effect. You know, if Israel is really righteous, they will enable God or help God in a way to bring this messianic realm about. This entire picture seems to be falling apart, and we see it in Job's complaints. This should not be happening, he keeps saying to his friends. His friends are perfectly, you know, they're like the good evangelicals today. They know their Bible as well as anyone could. And if you examine their advice, the advice they give to Job, it is absolutely biblical in the old Deuteronomic sense. But Job says that cannot be true. Something else must be true. Something else that we don't know yet must explain what has happened to me. It isn't my sin. It isn't anything God's doing to correct me. It appears to me, he says, that God is just being cruel. He compares God to the wicked who trampled the poor. He says things about God that his friends must have thought would have brought on lightning, you know, several lightning strikes. And in fact, thunder does come up at the end of Job, maybe a little humor. The friends probably thought, well, this is it. God's going to strike Job dead for the things he said. But that isn't what happened. And so we come to the speeches at the end where God, for the only time in Hebrew history, in literary history, God shows up. An author dares to have God become a character in the literature. When God speaks in the other parts of the Bible, he's really speaking, right? The prophets is God speaking. The writer of Job creates a character. He creates God, and he brings God in to speak to Job. Now, of course, I'm taking this as poetics. Most people like me would not take Job as a simple history book. It's a highly crafted story that's supposed to have a meaning. And what God says to Job is usually interpreted to be bullying. You know, who do you think you are, Job? You know, I'm God, and where were you when I created the foundations of the world? In other words, they understand the tone of those speeches to be angry, and they understand the message that God is giving Job in all these pictures as a rebuke. But that doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons. One of which is at the end, God praises Job. He says, Job has spoken truly. The friends have spoken so falsely that he tells Job to pray for them. Go sacrifice for them, pray for them. They need forgiveness. And all they've done is quote scripture to Job. And so there's quite an irony there. So you go back and you say, well, if Job spoke truly, how do we read the speeches? And you get a lot of help here from several writers. But what I argue in the book with them, you know, with their help, experts on Job, is that God is giving Job images of himself, God, in relation to things that are thought to be God forsaken. The imagery, it's a very familiar imagery to ancient Hebrews, is the imagery of this conflict between powers of primordial chaos, beginning with Genesis itself, the deep, and the creative power of God who brings order, brings cosmos, chaos versus cosmos. It's an ancient Near Eastern theme. Israel has its own version of that, and it's a magnificent poetic tradition. But in that tradition, it's always God the warrior slaying the great chaos monster, Leviathan, Rahab, sometimes paired up as a male and female. It's a triumphal image that carries a promise, thematic promise, that God is really beating up on these anti-cosmic realities. They have no part in God's plan. And so if you are suffering, if you're an animal or a human, if you're a human like Job, it's clear that God has rejected you. If you're an animal like the ostrich who runs around out in the wilderness screeching, mindlessly, or a jackal, um, God has forsaken you. These animals almost symbolize desolation, and they're doomed, and in the new heaven and the new earth, they won't be there. And I argue in a rather roundabout and complex way we don't have time to go into in detail that the divine speeches in Job, reconstruct all of that. And instead of picturing God as beating up on these creatures, these realities, starting with the sea, which is always an enemy of God, is going to be removed. The monster Leviathan going to be cut into pieces and scattered. These animals representing desolation. In these speeches, God it's really shocking, actually, I think, to the Hebrew reader. God is intimately, caringly involved with these things, to the point where it's very strongly suggested that God has deliberately included them in the world. He's made a covenant with the chaos monster. I mean, if he's a midwife to the sea. If you're an original Hebrew reader, your eyes are bugging out by now. Your jaw is dropping. You're wondering what in the world is going on here. We've never heard anything like this. And what I think is going on there is a new way of looking at God and these chaotic things. A new thing. The new thing is that God is working in and not against them to simply remove them, but working in and through them, weaving them into the tapestry of his messianic cosmos. So he's doing more than just beat up on them and destroy them like a warrior. He's in a very artistic fashion integrating these things together, with the final effect that the evil will be defeated, not just removed, but defeated in a technical sense, in the way that an artist will take something ugly that the artist has deliberately included in the art. He includes it there not to make the artwork worse, or not just to balance it off with good, although that's one kind of art. But the really brilliant artists, a lot of them modern artists, but some of them ancient, will eventually integrate that evil, that ugliness, into a larger whole, such that the whole is much greater because of the evil. And of course, I turn to the example in the New Testament of the cross, arguably the greatest evil that ever happened. God deliberately included it in his plan of redemption. And yet, the overall picture of redemption that we have in the end could not be as great as it is without that horrible evil. We wouldn't change it, would we? In retrospect, we wouldn't say, oh, when we have this picture of redemption, it's too bad the crucifixion is there. Let's just remove that because it's so bad. Yeah, it remains an evil, but it's an evil that's been defeated, if you understand what you're following here. It's defeated by the great beauty and goodness of the whole that we call reconciliation, redemption, the final consummation, the coming of the messianic kingdom to the whole world. And I go on, and in Job, okay, so back to Job, one of the longest sections in the divine speeches is about God and these wild animals that are supposed to be forsaken, doomed to desolation. Instead, the divine speaker pictures God intimately involved in caring for them, even in the wilderness, right? He provides the lion with its prey. In some shocking imagery there, he provides the vultures with dead bodies on a battle of war. That's a pretty hard one to take. Job is talking some very serious stuff here. Why does this seriously terrible stuff happen? Is it grounds for disbelieving in God? Is a modern way of putting it? Is it grounds for giving up on the messianic promise, if you're Job in Judaism? And the answer there is no. Contrary to appearances, these things do not negate the truth. They just change our way of approaching the truth of God's promise. Because God's working in a way we didn't expect. And it's a hard way, and it involves a lot of suffering. No one expected the Messiah to die. No one expected anything of the sort. In fact, one of the reasons the Christians were rejected by the majority of their own people was the cross. So these are not things I take lightly. I say, oh yeah, well, God just integrates them into the world and they go away. No, there's a terrible price that is paid for all these good things that we believe God is bringing about. But Job, I argue, gives the Christian a strongly biblical reason to think along these lines. They're not this is not just philosophical lines, but they're canonical lines, and so Job lends a biblical authority to thinking about this kind of aesthetic approach.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So thank you, John. And it's a very important part of your book, so I encourage people to check that out. It's linked down below if you want to check out the book. But my last question for you, and we're going to a little bit of Q&A. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, is how does the animal afterlife play into your theodicy, John? It's the last chapter of your book, so talk a little bit about that and how it kind of puts things together in your mind.
Well, this is controversial, and I don't claim to know in a strong sense that what I propose is true, with all those caveats. I do think it makes sense to think that if God created something, that God would want it to endure. If God created an array of non-human beings, why would God want them to just disappear? Why would God want extinction to be the last word on 99.9% of the species that God created? If we believe God created them. That doesn't make immediate sense. It makes more sense that God would want to preserve them. So there's an intuition there. Admittedly, it's a controversial intuition, but an intuition is I guess it's kind of an artistic intuition. Artists they don't use disappearing paint typically unless they're trying to make some kind of weird point about the temporality of art. I mean, the idea that God would include animals in the messianic realm isn't far-fetched. And of course, there's some suggestions of it in the famous scene on the Lord's Mountain, where the wolf lies down with the lamb. The animal imagery. So I give a list of reasons why I think we should at least take very seriously the possibility, if not probability, that heaven, the messianic realm, will include not just human beings, but non-human ones as well. And that the victory, the defeat of evils will not just be for humans, but for non-humans too.
So what does this look like then for animals, John? In your book, you talk about, if I remember it right, the idea that not necessarily like Trent Dougherty wants to go all the way and say that they may be able to like consciously reflect on like their suffering and things on that. But I believe, if I remember right, your view is more like they may have like recognition of like what they did in a sense, but more of a like how we like praise a dog for like being good, like something like that. Like people elaborate on that.
You're exactly right. Trent and I we agree that animals will be there, but where we part ways a little bit is on, Trent thinks that animals will be given a human-like cognitive capacities so that they can begin making choices for or against God in Christ. Whereas I think animals have had enough trouble already in this life, so that would almost be cruel to force them to make a choice like that, and threaten them with eternal damnation if they refused. I don't find that part. Trent's book is one of the best books on this subject that's been written, probably better than mine. But that part of his book I don't find terribly persuasive for several reasons I won't go into. But as far as my own view, I think it makes more sense to think that animals retain their former identity as being cognitively different from humans, remaining the animals that they are and always have been, and yet immortalized. Everything in heaven is, well, the ancient Greek fathers call it divinization. the risen Jesus is not going to die again, and the risen Christian is not going to die again, and the risen animal is not going to die again. The risen animal is going to be transformed in some way, but not, I'm suggesting, in such a way so radical and dramatic that it's really no longer the same animal that it was before. And I think that cognitive change would turn them into persons in a sense that would somewhat violate that continuity of identity. But what I do suggest is that because of the tremendous sacrifice that animals have made, the tremendous role, the unimaginable contribution that they have made, not only to each other but to humans, and continue to do, that it makes sense to me that they would be treated in heaven in a way that is analogous to the way we are taught that Christian martyrs would be treated. People who've made unusual sacrifices for Christ, who are elevated then to a somewhat higher position than the ordinary one, whatever that is in heaven. They according to the traditions anyway, the martyrs receive praises constantly for what they've done. And the evils that happen to them are in that way somewhat defeated, integrated into a form of life that they will enjoy forever. And so I don't see anything too wild in the thought that animals will enjoy the praise of the angels and God and humans in heaven as a matter of gratitude. And we know, in the book I mentioned, that we do know that some animals, at least, pretty clearly recognize praise, even on this side of the grave. I've trained dogs, many dogs over years, and it's clear to me and to many trainers that praise is sometimes the most effective way to get a dog to behave in the way that it should. Punishment doesn't always work as well as praise. And horses and a lot higher animals that clearly seem, at least, to enjoy praise from the people working with them. And so I think that what I'm suggesting could just be a continuation of something that's already developing in the animal mind. How that works out with really small, lower species, I have no idea. Will all species, mosquitoes, nasty parasites, things like that, will they be in heaven too, in some form? I really don't know, but if they are, it would be a very different form, I would think, than the one they have now. And then there are other suggestions that maybe some beings are better off gone, except in memory, and maybe they would function something like the way in which some of the people you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you mentioned people that, well, the contrast of evil helps us to appreciate the good. Maybe some of those creatures don't have the kind of value that would require God to immortalize them. But I really have no clear view on that.
Yeah, well, thanks for spelling it out, John. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A, so if you have questions, feel free to ask. We'll do a couple before we wrap up here. We have a question from Jonah, which said, what is Dr. Schneider's thoughts on the modern animal welfare movement, and how has this impacted his life? So I don't know if you have any, how your views have been impacted, thinking about, animal suffering on, these questions, John?
Well, I mean, one way it's, I've thought for a long time, even before I became aware of animal welfare as a movement, which I guess you could say it is. It's a relatively recent one. I've thought for some time that animal welfare should be a factor in our moral thinking, in our laws, our legal systems. It wasn't very long ago that in the handbook that was used by all veterinarians in England and the United States, they advised against using anesthetics. They didn't use anesthetics for surgery or for anything if they followed that recommendation. And part of the reason for that was that people there's a very widespread belief that animals couldn't really suffer in a way that was morally significant. They didn't have minds of the sort that could enable them to suffer. And I've never thought that was true. So having said that, I've had numerous friends who are very, very zealous about animal rights and animal welfare. And, maybe some of them go a little too far. I don't know. I tend to resist extremes. It's just kind of my nature. But yeah, I'm generally very much in favor of these developments. I mean, some of the factory farming. I think a lot of the stuff that goes on in factory farming is just demonstrably evil, and Christians should join others in certainly disapproving it, and if possible, reforming it. Um, I'm not a vegan. I don't believe it's immoral to kill and eat animals. Um, always, I don't think it's inherently immoral and extrinsically wrong, but it's something we certainly should not take for granted. I mean, if an animal gives its life, we should see that as something sacred. Um, Killing plants too. I mean, seems to me that there is a certain sense in all which plants have a right to live out their lives. And so we're killing one way or the other. But
Mm.
the animal welfare thing, as a matter of law, I I generally think it's a very good thing. And the reforms that are being called for in factory farming. I mean, we still raise veal. I mean, there's just some disgraceful things that are going on. And I think alongside that, in parallel to those changes, we're learning more and more about the sophistication of animal minds. We're learning things about rats and chickens that make it impossible for me to think that these creatures don't suffer from certain practices that should certainly be eliminated or mitigated. If we're going to eat animals, we should certainly eliminate those practices.
Mm. Well,
So,
thank you, John. Really appreciate your thoughts on this topic. We have one more question that we'll bring up before we wrap things up here. It's a question from Invoking Theism, which says, if a canonical theism is a good God-justifying reason, he made a mistake, a typo there, for the instantiation of Darwinian worlds, then doesn't that add to the complexity of the hypothesis of the theistic response? So I think what he's trying to get at here is if we look at saying that maybe God would instate like a world with like evolution for like the allowance of like a canonical theism, would that make like theism a more complicated hypothesis when trying to explain like the world?
let me just read that for a quick second here.
Hmm.
Um, if canonical theism is a good God justifying reason, okay, yeah, well, um, the, I guess it is kind of adding complexity to theism because you've got, instead of a very simple story of God saying, let there be this and let there be that, and there was this and there was that. I mean, that's a very simple, straightforward story. Instead of that story, you've got this Darwinian story. Yeah. But I guess the question would be, is it a kind of complexity that is so clumsy and incorrigible that it makes theism um, implausible, or is it a kind of complexity that makes things more interesting? I mean, I tend to think that if properly formulated, evolutionary creationism is a more interesting story of creation than the simple young Earth type of, or even old Earth form of creationism. That simplicity has the advantage of being comprehensible and often easier to defend, and certainly easier to explain. But it comes with its own baggage too, explanatory baggage, and
Mm.
you guys are well aware of those
Yeah.
areas of problem.
Mm. There's something beautiful in thinking about like the complexity of our world. Like I was even thinking about as you were talking, John, like when I was in first grade, and we were like learning about dinosaurs, and like I was never raised up in like a younger like mindset, but I remember as a Christian being like at that in first grade being like, wait, how does that make sense of like what I read in Genesis 1 the other day? But
Yeah.
then over time, you come to appreciate other alternatives, and I think about the idea of dinosaurs existing for like millions of years. That just seems really cool to me, and
Well,
obviously, like we have to address the problem of like suffering. But, like, there's something beautiful to that.
there
So,
is
yeah.
something I mean, the fascination that dinosaurs, these ancient beasts, elicit in little children is a
Mhm.
great thing. I mean, I mean, I've got 2 grandsons who that's all they do is play with dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
They're just endless. They're real world monsters, and that they lived so long ago and in such strange times and lands is it's a very fascinating thing. I'm not sure the world is better. Would the world that world, you know, as we construct it and along evolutionary lines, old Earth lines, is in any way inferior to the one in which God just creates them all at once. It's kind of a crowded, clumsy world if you think about it. And of course, the ecology would be a real problem, having humans and dinosaurs living together. But um, you know, where there's a will to explain, there's always a way. But yeah, I think it is it is real complexity. And I guess the essence of my work is it's not just the complexity and the awkwardness of trying to put it all together, because it's hard. You know, I think there's a lazy streak in all of us. You know, I think sometimes, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but I think sometimes the real simple reading of the Bible is kind of lazy. And it's just like, man, it can't be that hard. I don't want to put that much work into it. And I kind of understand that, but I don't think that's necessarily the best response. And we got, maybe we have some work to do. And maybe one of the reasons, God, you asked me before we went on, what if you could get into God's mind, what reasons do you think God might have for using such a complex means of creation as Darwinian evolution? One suggestion that some have made is that, well, it certainly makes us think. It is an amazingly
Love that.
sophisticated thought, inquiry, humility to some extent, that we don't know everything. There are a lot of intellectual and moral goods that come about from responding to these questions. And maybe that's part of the reason God left us to answer them instead of just spoon feeding us and answering them himself.
Yeah, that's really great. One thing to leave you on the way out, John, with is Tim had one more question, which said, could you give like an idea of some of the aesthetic goods that result from the evolutionary story? So, is there anything you quickly want to comment on here before we wrap up?
Well, there's tremendous beauty. We talked about the tragic beauty. There's something very, very beautiful about Darwin himself. Before he died, he had a lot of doubts about God because of the suffering and things that his science was beginning to uncover. But he also said, when you look back at this tapestry, this whole story, there's something magnificent, sublimely beautiful about it too. So he went back and forth that way. So there is beauty there, and I would encourage people to read, if not my book, some other people who've written about this quite eloquently. Some of them Christians, some of them not. Some of them just philosophers, people describing the beauty. I mean, nature writers. I mean, nature, despite its harshness, nature red in tooth and claw. That's not the only thing to say about nature. There is a tremendous beauty as well. Most of us experience it when we become familiar with nature. Darwinism creates a kind of a new form of both the evils in nature and the goods, including the forms of beauty.
Well, thank you so much, John, for coming on today. It's been so much fun, and so much fun talking to you. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Good. Thank you very much for having me on. Take care.
Yeah, and thank you everyone who tuned in and asked questions. We're so grateful for your time. We wish you the best. Always encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. And if you value our content, please consider our Patreon at patreon.com/Apologetics. But yeah, John, thank you so much for your time. So grateful.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. God bless.